Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Ethically Speaking. And I'll put a call out to folks joining us by Zoom. Hopefully you can hear, but our expert IT assistant and also postdoc in our center, Josh Kissel, is at the controls. So he's going to make this work a lot better than I could. Thank you, Josh. I'm Steve Kubler. I'm professor of chemistry and optics and co-founder of the UCF Center for Ethics and founder of this speaker series for the center. And it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Denny Elliott joining us today to talk about media. This is such a huge question in our society. What are our ethical responsibilities for information and media that we curate, that we pass on, that we repost? All of those questions come to mind. And it's an important discussion that we've all had, but probably not in a very structured way. So we're grateful to Dr. Elliott to come and talk to us. But before she is properly introduced by my colleague, Dr. Beaver, I want to give a shout out to those organizations here on campus that helped found this speaker series. So these are the inaugural departments and colleges that ponied up money, but more than anything, showed great partnership in allowing us to stand up a series on ethics writ large, where we could have people coming from ethics, coming from education, coming from the sciences to cultivate conversations. And I think that long list should give some sense of where for faculty, staff, and even students, as our research shows, ethics is very important. And we want to develop a campus-wide understanding of what an ethics culture can be and what it can look like with help from our speakers. So the way we'll run today is that we're doing this in person, but also obviously with Zoom, and we're very happy to have so many people joining us by Zoom. My very capable assistant moderator, Dr. Beaver, is going to moderate the discussion after the presentation by Dr. Elliott. So with usual aplomb, he's going to take questions from Zoom. So feel free to put questions in chat as they come up, and he'll curate those and pass those questions on to Dr. Deni. If our audio is working, we might even be able to unmute and allow you to pose your question on your own. We'll see how that goes. Thank you in advance for your patience. But with that, if Dr. Beaver's ready, I'll go ahead and introduce him and let him tell you about Dr. Elliott's career, and then welcome her. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kubler. I'm really grateful to everybody in the room, but also the growing number of folks who are joining us via Zoom. I will reiterate something that our colleagues have said, that the hybrid era is upon us, and I know sometimes we struggle with that, but it's really nice to be able to do things in multiple modes. The access is really important to me in particular. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Denio Elliott here. Dr. Elliott is professor emerita in the Department of Journalism and Digital Communications at the University of South Florida, just across the state from us, where she held the Eleanor Poynter Jameson Chair in Media Ethics and Press Policy until just last year. She formally retired. She's the co-chief and project officer of the National Ethics Project, a project between the Association of Practical and Professional Ethics, APPE, and the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. And she's been running that project with colleagues since 2015. That project, if I remember, is originally funded by Spencer, so it came from external funds, and has been a long-running project looking at how ethics is taught across our institutions. Dr. Elliott has authored more than 200 articles and book chapters for scholarly trade and the lay press, and has been part of the authorship team for at least 10 books since the mid-1980s, a long and distinguished career. Dr. Elliott's work has been an inspiration for our center's programming, in particular, including in that she wrote and co-hosted a weekly radio brief for syndication through PRX, Public Exchange Network, Radio Exchange, titled Ethically Speaking, that ran from 2003 to 2006. That name inspired the name for our lecture series here, Ethically Speaking. We're very pleased to host Dr. Elliott today for a talk titled Sources and Sorcery, the Ethics of Curating, Creating, and Consuming Media. Dr. Elliott, the floor is yours.
Hi there, in-person people and Zoom land people. I'm happy to be here. Just a couple of things by way of introduction. First of all, I'm impressed with the interdisciplinary focus of your campus on ethics. That's, you know, I mean, my age shows in so many ways. But when I was in graduate school, one of my claims to fame was that Larry Colbert from the psychology department at Harvard and Cecil Bach from philosophy at Harvard were on my dissertation committee. And it's the first time in their long and distinguished careers that they had ever been on the same dissertation committee. So, that was nice, but that was, well, I was gonna say not that long ago, but yeah, it was. But this idea of practical ethics bringing together all sorts of disciplines and foci and ideology is something that actually has only been going on for 3,000 or so years. But we're finally talking about it in a way that engages everyone again, and I have just been grateful to be part of that. The other thing, just sort of a by the way, is I'm legally blind. I've got my guide dog here at my feet. I can see some things up close, but out there, it's all really wonderful kaleidoscope. I'd say, kind of reminds me of the 70s, but it's but the point is that I'll be talking with you, and I will ask you just to speak out rather than wait for recognition, because as I told my students many, many times over the years, it might be that I'm ignoring you, but until you say something, you're not going to know for sure. So today we're talking about creating, curating, and consuming media, most particularly news media, journalism. And I have to admit that the creating, curating part was just because I like the alliteration. But when you really get down to it, we're all creating, curating, and I will get to that toward the end. What I want to do is to start by asking you what you see as ethical issues in media. And we're hearing a lot about it, but I'm just curious, what do you see as what's going on today?
What's the difference between fake news and real news?
So is that
Yeah.
what you're identifying as being ethical issue?
That's
All right, and what is the ethics component of that then?
Well, first of all, who's providing the fake news and what's the purpose and how do we recognize that it's fake?
And why would that matter to you?
Because we're after the truth. We want to see the truth of an event.
Okay,
Did this event take place?
great, okay.
Opinions are opinions, but we want to know if facts are facts correct.
Mhm.
If they give the wrong facts, then they draw the wrong conclusions, obviously, but if they want.
Great, so you seek the truth, you want to know what you can believe, and so it matters to you if things are fake or not.
Yes.
Good.
Not only to me, but to the body politic.
Well, you're part of the body politic
Yes.
too. Good, okay, what else? Someone else?
In Zoom, somebody had said perception of privacy, mass disinformation.
Okay, perception of privacy, so in the internet era, I was just suddenly flashed on this New Yorker cartoon from years ago, where these two dogs sitting there by a computer and one dog saying to the other, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And then there was, I think about 2 years ago, kind of a historical replay of that particular cartoon where dog number 1 is saying to dog number 2, you remember when nobody knew if you were a dog? So yeah, so things have changed. The idea that we are exposed in ways that we don't even know. Okay, good. So, right, so individual privacy is an issue. What else?
Lack of transparency in terms of the information provided, where it comes from, what one's level of expertise is, and their ability to speak about something in a way that is authoritative.
Okay, so are you talking AI or just in general?
In general, like I'm thinking about journalism, how many journalists, for instance, or like opinion writers might be writing, having a platform that makes it seem more authoritative and they're able to actually have credibility for, or be partial in ways that matter in journalism.
Right. Yeah, that's where the sorcery bit comes in, the sources and sorcery, which was a book title I never got around to filling in as a book. But that idea that you're trusting a mediator, if you will, and you don't have access to the primary source. So how do you know whether to believe this mediator or not? Good. So the credibility issues. Great. Anything else? Anybody want to talk about?
Okay, there's others in the
Oh,
chat.
sorry,
No, please go ahead.
sort of building on his, but on the ethics of mainstream media and sort of who's controlling the narrative. And like the effect that that has on like society as a whole.
Okay, good. Right. So the idea of what is the ideology that this message is wrapped in? And how does that affect what you're getting or what you're not getting? Okay. Any other?
Mita in the chat has said agency in data collection. So who's in charge of collecting data and who's capable of doing so?
Right. And yeah, some of us were raised to think that, data is just facts. It's neutral. It's, you can't fool around with it. Yeah, right. Start doing research and immediately you find out how you can fool around with it. Right. So that, what's the source of data? What's being included? What's being left out?
And then two people have given thumbs up to Paul's comment in the chat that it's the issue of money potentially swaying what information gets.
Oh, good. That's going to take me very quickly into myths of journalism. So I'll get there in a minute. Just one more question, and then I'm going to talk for a bit, and we'll come back to more conversation. And I'm impressed with your description of ethical issues in media. The what's the source, which comes out a lot in the AI conversations these days. Deep fakes. What do you believe? Can't even believe what you see anymore, much less in terms of whether something is quote fake news or not, which is a handy pile of mud to throw, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. Something else that is seems to be particularly prevalent these days is the problem of false equivalency. The idea that if you present one thing, you need to present the other side. Well, many stories have lots of sides, and like when we have a direct hit hurricane, it has one side. But so there aren't really many stories that have that automatic polarization. And if you've got a journalist who is pairing extreme right with extreme left, there's a whole lot of majority in between just being left out. A lot of the writing in climate change, although I think that this is changing somewhat, is a good example of false equivalency, where you've got really incredibly good science telling us something about human causes in environmental problems. But then that's paired with somebody who says, oh no, that's not true. And it always reminds me of flat earth controversy. We can talk about lots of things about the world, but saying, oh, but there are people who believe that the earth is flat, really is not going to help us much with that story. So that false equivalency is a problem as well. So you've done a great job of identifying areas of ethical concern for media. But now my next question is, and I know there are a lot of people who do ethics in the room, so what makes these ethical issues? And I'll underscore ethical.
The potential to produce consequences that have high stakes to the point of harming people or disrespecting people, harming their dignity.
Okay, so potential of causing harm, for example, with the privacy issue, that's a big deal. If you act on material that is fake, that's a big deal, right? So, yeah, so the possibility of individual harm is right there in what we think of as an ethical issue. Don't cause me harm unless you've got a really, really good reason to do so. And we can agree as a community that you've got a good reason to do so. Good. Anything else?
I think the flip side is possible benefits, right, and distribution of those benefits, right, and the certain interests that are served by the way we respond to these questions, about the expense of others.
Good, yeah, right. So what is the benefit? And this is important when we talk about established practices like journalism, in that they have existed in society for a very, very long time in terms of information giving to mass audiences. And it's because there's some benefit of that. And just to have kind of a tagline to kind of get it out of the way, generally for about the past 50 years or so, people have talked about the special job of journalism being to provide citizens with information that people need for self-governance. And to do so without fear or favor, to do so without kowtowing to special interests, but just to be a source for individuals. Okay, so my goals for today, there are 3 or something like that. One is to make sure that we're sort of talking from the same starting place. So thank you very much. We've done that. I appreciate knowing that we share some common definitions. That helps a lot in having a conversation about this stuff. A couple of things that I want to talk about for a few minutes are myths of journalism. I mean, things that just crushed me, you know, when I was in graduate school and realized they weren't true. And about what we can expect, I would say, them to do. And by them, I mean government. I mean people with a lot of wealth and ability to influence. And then I want to circle back to what we can do. Because, and I will mention, just to show that there's no necessary problem between combining ethics with self-interest. I have a book called Ethics in the First Person, and it's all about the fact that we really need to talk about I and we and us if we're going to make any progress in work in ethics. But let me get back to the myths of journalism. Money came up. So I'm just going to give a few examples of history. The idea is that the myth is that journalism is somehow pure when combined with public relations or advertising, that journalism is supposed to be about public service and about giving people what we need, rather than trying to promote the interests of, is somebody trying to sell soap? Well, there's always been a combination of business interests with ethical ideals in journalism. And in fact, I think people are often surprised that the business interests came first and then ethical ideals developed out of those. So I just want to give you a few examples of that. Actually, starting with the printing press. Gutenberg in about 1450 came up with not movable type, Chinese had done that a long time ago, but an ability to be able to make quick duplications of material. The Gutenberg press, you may have heard of it, quite popular. And it sounds like it's such a good thing in terms of suddenly the religious texts that were important at the time no longer needed to be just read and interpreted by the important people of the church. Everyone could get access to it. That was so exciting. One of the things that Gutenberg realized very early on, though, was that there was a way that his press could make life a lot easier for people in terms of indulgences. Hope anyone knows that term, but at the time, if you were a good Catholic, as people were supposed to be, the way that you got dead relatives from purgatory to heaven was by indulgences, by basically, asking God for that favor. And indulgences were hand lettered by monks. They took days to create, and of course were quite ornate. And the more ornate, the easier it was to get your dead relative out of purgatory into heaven. And Gutenberg said, hey, wait a minute. We can make hundreds of indulgences on my printing press, in a matter of hours rather than these things in days. And so once Gutenberg started doing that, three things happened. The church lost money, people saved money, printers made money. It was really the first, the first printing press was actually the start of entrepreneurial press, which within a couple of hundred years was well established in Europe. And then, as we all know, entrepreneurial press, that is press separate from government, played an important part in the American Revolution. The press was an advocate. It was ideological, it was nationalistic. It was promoting revolution. And it did so well that, got a mention in the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights and with the US Constitution. And we in the US have been privileged as compared to a lot of countries around the world, just in terms of the fact that freedom of the press is one of the individual rights that's recognized in the First Amendment. So this idea that the press is ideological is something that we've been used to for a long time. Well, it kind of goes in and out anyway. Because what happened is that in the United States, by about the late 1800s, journalism and advertising had developed a really close relationship. Basically, because of advertisement, we had the penny press. We had the ability for a penny for news to be open and available to everybody. And that was just remarkable. It helped promote literacy in the country. It gave us all a shared knowledge. We could have a conversation because we could all get access. But it also put advertising in the role of controlling what was going on. By about 1900, about 75% of the newspaper's space was taken up by display advertising, which meant that journalists then had to compete against the display ads by having sensationalized headlines and sketches and then photographs that would draw people in and so it was like this tension between journalism and advertising. But that business relationship was always close. And then soon after, I think it was about 1920, we had our first code of ethics in the United States, Journalism Code of Ethics, our first graduate school, Columbia University School of Journalism, because the elite press, that is New York Times, Washington Post style press, they wanted to make sure that the public service didn't get lost in all the sensationalism, yellow journalism, hoaxes, things that were going on, both to counteract the effect of advertising in the newspaper, as well as when you've got, 15 newspapers in New York City competing for readers, you want to find some way of standing out. And so between the competition and competition between papers, which were all ideological, by the way, there were socialist papers and conservative papers and liberal papers and anarchist papers and underground papers, every possible kind of paper was going on to find the right audience. It's not so unlike what's going on the internet today. We all may use the internet to get our first dose of information, but I bet we go to different sources. We can go back to that in a while. The good news for all of this competition was the development of the telegraph. And I want you to notice that what an important part technology is playing as we sort of move through the years. With the telegraph, suddenly newspapers stopped competing in the same way. Because the news organizations realized that they could form co-ops called wire services, basically, that would then send a small pool of reporters and photographers to a distant spot to report. And then instead of reporting just to one newspaper in Washington, DC, say, they could report for news organizations all around the country. But that really changed what audiences look like, because rather than targeting audiences, the pooled reporters and photographers were producing stories that would play anywhere. They would play regardless of what your ideology was, regardless of what your religion was, regardless of what your geography was. And that got codified in about the middle of the 20th century as objectivity. I call it blander the better. That the blander you could make the story, the less controversial, the less likely it was to annoy somebody or counteract somebody's web of belief, the more likely it was to get picked up by news organizations all around the country. That idea of neutrality, objectivity, the journalist as the chronicler, and not inserting themselves into the story really kind of got us through a lot of the 20th century. And then came the next paradigm shift with digital technology. And that changed journalism in really major ways. First, in the 20th century paradigm, we had limited physical news products, whether it was the 6 o'clock news or the newspaper itself that came out in the morning or in the evening. The content was controlled by space and time. Great thing for philosophers to talk about. The content was practitioner controlled. Whoever owned the presses had the power. And people got exposed to stuff that they didn't expect just because of, unconnected things were all put together. So think about a newspaper or a traditional news program. You've got 23 minutes of news in a traditional 30-minute news program. And you might be interested in one story, but you're probably going to sit around and, let seep in all these other stories that you never would have heard about. So that's how people got enlightened about the world. In the digital age, instead of having like a broad veneer of information as we had in the 20th century, instead we have links. So we can drill down deeper in the story, but we can also ignore everything except for the one piece of news that we want to react to. That user control, I think, has really changed how it is we need to think about ethics and journalism at this point in time. But I don't want to completely ignore the fact that government has a role and the creators of technology have a role. So let me just say a few things about that, and then you can be thinking in the back of your mind, well, excuse me, please stop scratching. Thank you. We've only been together 12 weeks. We're still learning each other. It's like an arranged marriage. We grew up with it. Okay. What I'd like you to be thinking about, because we're going to come to this, is what does it mean to have user control rather than practitioner control of media? And we can dispute that as well. Just in terms of regulation, I just want to say that deception, for example, FTC has for 20-ish years had really clear regulation on deception and hidden motives. So like, for example, if you write a blog and you get free products that you then promote in your blog, it's illegal to do that without telling your audience that you're, being paid for this promotion. I'm sure you've heard about concerns about AI and what's going to happen with the upcoming election. There's been at least one executive order signed regarding use of AI within federal agencies in terms of producing information. And last count, there were 9 Senate bills addressing the concerns about AI and federal elections. And the Federal Election Commission is now taking public comment on whether to disallow ads that use AI to create false impressions or just outright lies. So that's one thing. Government regulation has always been important, even with the First Amendment, and it will continue to be. Second thing is people who develop technology. It's possible to fight technology with technology. So, for example, in the creation of AI, at the same time that artificial intelligence or the ability for generative synthetic information is developed, the folks developing that can also create ways of detecting it. It hasn't been financially profitable to do so. There have been some small attempts. There is, my favorite is something called True Media, which trains AI to recognize deep fakes and is in use now by journalists, fact checkers, and folks like that. Another way that they can make a difference is by creating a new business model. One of my favorites about this is the Institute of Nonprofit News, which is 425 plus news organizations in the country that are not tied to advertising or commercial benefit. They are really focused on public service. It's not a new idea. I mean, NPR has been doing that for a long time, but the idea, well, without the pledge drives. But the idea that we can somehow create business models for community, a lot of them are local community outlets. Some of them are advocacy, like in sustainability areas. Some of them are investigative reporting, some are student investigative reporting. They're all over the place, but it's certainly worth looking at. There's also a way of combining technology and regulation. For example, in the European Union, their Digital Services Act, I think it's called, is now requiring social media to disclose when AI is used. It's possible to find that out. It's possible to disclose it. It's a lot more fun and sensational if you don't. What's interesting to me is that consumer-based detection is lagging far behind. In higher education, we tend to worry about AI and plagiarism with students. Although I have to admit, I'm always somewhat amused when I'm working with faculty who are concerned about this issue and who talk about how they build their syllabus using AI. And I say, well, do you disclose that to your students? Generally, no. So a major change between the 20th and 21st century journalism is user control. We have the power to influence because we all create, curate, as well as consume news. In the 20th century, people just felt controlled by mediators, by a decreasing number of owners of news media, in fact, over those years. And they were right to feel like, how do I know what's real? How do I know that there's not something else out there? We have no excuse. So first of all, let me ask the question about creation. how many of you have a blog? Write a blog? No one? Nobody online writes a blog? Seriously?
We've got one hand
One
on.
hand. Okay, good.
My
Well-
life's just not that interesting.
Yeah.
I hate to admit it.
Right. All right,
We have
two, good, right? Tell them to be careful about deception and, and whether they're getting paid to endorse certain things. How many of you have ever sent a link to somebody else saying you should read the story? That's why I said when I talk creation and curation, it's really just alliterations. We're all doing that. We're all passing stuff along. So how do you decide what to pass along?
And that we are interested in, right? Something that got our attention. So we want to.
Okay,
share.
it got your attention, so you want to share it. Do you ever worry about whether it's true or not?
Yes, and sometimes it's like, I don't know if it's true or not, so I want to share to get the opinion of other people
Right.
about that.
So it's kind of crowdsourcing.
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, if we all think it's true, it's gotta be
Yeah.
true.
Which
Right.
The voice is.
Okay. If you were, is there anyone who is inclined to check things out before passing them along? And if so, how do you do that? Speak.
So I often think about the source. What is the source of the news and what is their sources? And I'm often surprised by how often I'm being sent stuff from non-standard sources. And I'm bewildered about why society has not pendulum swung back from all the startup online
Mhm.
sources to the more tried and true media sources. That's been in my head for some time.
I agree with that, but also like, you have to check like the tried and true sources, cause you don't know like the, like sort of outside influences that might be acting on those like more mainstream, like media sources. So I think like just checking everything from everyone all the time is like a good like habit to get like into. So you're not just like sort of feeding into the greater power.
Right, except that also takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
I know I recently told students and critical, think critically, don't just absorb and accept, question things. And so that gets along with what you're saying, look at the source. And that's,
But how do you know what to question?
well, what seems to be happening a lot lately is something that I would grow up with, like whether it be a dietary restriction, oh, eggs are great for you or eggs are bad for you. Everything just seems to keep changing.
Now with Oprah.
Okay, well, there you go. Okay, throw that in the mix now. So,
Yeah.
I think that especially when something's different from what you've been raised or have been
Mhm.
taught, that's always kind of a red flag of let's explore this a little more because, maybe I do need to change my mind, possibly.
In the chat, we're hearing sort of three overlapping things. One, comparing sources. Two, looking at the positionality of sources. And three, Edie has said factcheck.org.
Factcheck.org is a good source. I'm gonna give you one that's even better in a minute. I wonder what positionality means in this context.
Well, that was the term I used. The folks in the chat have said things like, open the link and check the source, check the date before passing it along. Look at who the original poster of the post is and where they're located. Noticing authors are fake, fact checking videos, checking sources. A lot of that feels like it's, when folks are saying checking sources, it feels like they've got a sense in their mind of who an accurate source is.
Mhm.
So I'm imagining they're thinking about. Yeah, that's why I use the expression positioning.
I see. Right. And so with factchecker.org, and Snopes and lots of other places where, you might have heard, just, send the image there and see if it's the same image that appeared, in some other international conflict 40 years ago, that don't believe that this is for sure something that you're seeing from Gaza last week. So there's that, and there is, Duke University has a really nice website, reporterslab.org. And it is, it's more than 400 different fact-checking organizations that is within that umbrella. And it is, I wouldn't say curated, overused term today, curated by Duke in the sense of, looking at where the fact checkers come from. Because, okay, we've got questionable sources, but we also have questionable fact checkers. There's, just as journalism has never really been free of ideology, except during its objective blander the better stage. In the same way, fact checkers are not ideologically clear either. And so understanding where this come from is part of the fact checking process. So I would say that before you sort of latch onto a fact checker as having it right, first go to reporterslab.org and see if it's included there. And see what else is included there, because you can always end up changing your mind. This Institute of Nonprofit News Organizations is also a good place to go to check out a story, just because you've got more than 400 different, supposedly, public service oriented organizations that are looking at a story from all different points of view. And I am not going to tell you to give up your media comfort food. Whether it's Fox News or whether it's NPR or the New York Times or, the New York Post, you've got your favorite news source, which I hope is something other than TikTok. But
That's something we can all.
no, so I mean, there's nothing wrong with social media. It's just that you really do need to start with some I'd say mainstream news source as well. So if you see something in your mainstream news source that you think may be questionable, you want to triangulate it before you pass it along. You want to check with your fact-checking organization, which you can find through Reporters Lab. You can run the story through this Institute of Nonprofit News Organizations, and see how other people are telling the same story. One of the things I do on newspapers on airplane rides, of which I do a lot of, is I'll watch, like on the screen on the airplane. I'll watch MSNBC for 10-15 minutes, and then I'll watch Fox News for 10-15 minutes, and I just sort of bounce around to see how the same story is reported. And actually, one of the things I always find most interesting is how rarely the same story is reported. That what I found to my surprise when I purposely got out of my comfort zone, keep holding on to my comfort food, but still checking out some other things, is that rather than one news organization or outlet saying A and the other saying not A, one says A, one says B, one says C, one says D. And it actually may be the same news story, but just told from a slightly different angle. And told in a way that it's not really easy to say, well, do I believe this or that instead? That's why we need the nonprofit news sources, and that's why we need the fact-checking news sources. But I think what's most important is for us all to understand that what we used to talk about them doing, we now need to talk about us doing. One of the areas I'm working right now has to do with international media literacy. We've been teaching media literacy courses around the world in pockets for about 50 years. And there really has not been much research done on that in terms of efficacy. I'd like to believe that media literacy, that is helping people learn how to consume media, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for folks learning to use the power that we all have to communicate in a legitimate way. But so, we need to understand the critical thinking is, as you said, we need to learn how to take in communication with a little bit of skepticism. Actually, I would say not just mass communication, but interpersonal communication as well, but that's a different topic. And I'm going to go back to I'm going to end and open it up to more conversation with something that Socrates said about 400 BCE. And that was, if you have the power to communicate, and again, that's what we all have now, that we need to do it with the intent of helping people find the truth and seek goodness. Aristotle, a couple generations out after Socrates, kind of said the same thing, in that our job as autonomous, rational beings is to become the best people that we can be. And complaining about how bad things are out there isn't getting us there. So, your turn. Thoughts? Tell me why I'm wrong. I'm going to Spain in a couple of months to talk about this with some international scholars. I need to get better at it.
One quick comment. I think your call to action becomes weaponized. You can advocate for some truth. Maybe you've done your due diligence, fact checking and whatnot. And someone says, well, why do you believe that? You should check your facts. I mean, literally, that the earth is flat. Literally, last night, that happened to me. So suddenly I was placed on the defensive to exhaustively prove everything out there that suggests that the earth is round. And so I think your call to arms is often a weapon for silence and for building barriers. I hear it, I agree with it. I just don't see it as efficacious as I might wish it to be.
I appreciate that. And I'm wondering if instead of feeling like you need to defend your perspective, if instead you say, tell me more.
Oh, I'm not that good. I just gave up and walked away.
Well, but I'm actually doing with you what I'm suggesting you
right.
do.
But
So-
is it a waste of time? I wonder?
Well-
I mean, is it necessary? Actually, we talk about a search for truth and search for good. Good for whom? Is that good for me? Is that good for society to indulge that? I'm playing devil's advocate here. Why can't I just walk away and say, all right, you're not willing to put forth the effort that I have to maybe understand the shape of the earth or the media outlet or the content or to do all the searching, that she suggested of alternative sources. So maybe there's no basis for engagement. Maybe there's no contractual buy-in that we're going to actually engage in a process of truth finding. So I walk away. No?
Well, I'm going to say something that's kind of anathema to philosophers, but let's talk about faith here for a minute. Not really just faith, but if we have a choice between following, I guess, Steve, what I hear you suggesting is, what's the good of it anyway? And following what I've learned from my best friends or old dead philosophers, what I've learned from them over, so many years is that, okay, if you wanted to take the big three, if we're going to talk Aristotle, Kant, Mill, all three of them agree. I know philosophers, I used to say to teaching students, they all disagree with each other, which I think is a real pedagogical mistake, different lecture. But I would say that Aristotle, Kant, Mill, and a whole lot of other philosophers, the female persuasion as well, agree that the best way for me to find my own good, find what's good for me, is within a good community, a good society. That I stand the best chance of having a good life if the community has a good life. And I'm not worried about protecting myself every minute, for example. So I see your point. It's, it's the easiest thing, I think, is to be apathetic. Because not my fault, it's awful, I'm a victim, what can you do? Well, what I have been, I guess, trying to grow up students, for a long career, is the first day of every ethics seminar, every semester, I say, every one of us has the power and the responsibility to change the world. And my job is to help you each individually figure out how to do that. If I don't do that this semester, demand your money back because I haven't done my job.
So circle back to faith, you said, let's talk about faith. Do you mean faith in humanity and in?
What I mean is that when we have contrasting beliefs, and I think there are lots of variations between the, it's not going to do us any good. Why should I care about being good? I'm just taking care of myself, maybe, and I don't care about anything else. That kind of perspective, and I understand that that's a characterization. That's a hyperbole. It's not exactly what you said, and so I'm not trying to put you in that corner. But if we have that to choose from, or, well, I can be better than I am. I can learn things. Birth to death is a moral development exercise. Then which is a better way to live together? And I would argue that if we have to choose between those two extremes, being open, learning is going to take us further than isolated. But that's a longer conversation.
If I can just probe a bit more into this thought, just because it seems to me that there's a much more fundamental problem that I'm not sure we can even address. And that's the problem of who we think is a source, or who we agree is a credible source for information, right? Because in the example of the flat earther that Steve was talking to, right?
Mhm.
Presumably, unless Steve or whoever else is talking to a flat earther is a geographer or whatever, a scientist who knows exactly all the details of proofs of the earth being round, or the interlocutor knowing scientific facts, no one 100% understands and can prove some things, right? And this goes well beyond flat earthers and all sorts of things.
Mhm.
So I wonder, to the extent that we rely on testimonies for whatever,
Right.
more than 90% of what we're talking about, we need to start by taking a step back and agreeing on who we think can provide us a testimony that is credible.
Right.
And if we fundamentally disagree on that, then how do you even start convincing someone who thinks that, for instance, a professor or a body of professors who have dedicated their life to research are not as credible sources
Sure.
as a random person on the internet who makes some observational information and oversimplifies things? It feels like there's a whole level of cognitive distance that
Mhm.
cannot really be covered, even if we start the conversation and say,
Right.
tell me more. Because even if I ask someone to tell me more, I don't know if I can really, if I have the knowledge, the know-how, whatever that is, to convince them of something. As long as, they don't trust who I say that person said it, or these people believe it,
Mhm.
and the other way around, then it seems like we're still at that, bind where we can't really continue the conversation productively.
Right, and I think that's a really good point. I also think that psychology pretty much helps us understand that we can't convince anyone of anything. So I think that that's probably a problematic pursuit. And in terms of credible, I hope that by credible, you don't mean accurate. Because no source is always accurate. And one of the things I've talked about, journalistic truth as compared to scientific truth, is that journalistic truth is used loosely here, that journalism is evolving. That with scientific research, once we think we've got something right, we expect it to stay right, to be generalizable, to be reproducible. With journalism, it needs to be verifiable. It needs to be in touch with reality. But when I've worked as an ethics coach with news organizations, part of what's really fun to work with reporters and editors with is how a story evolves and how it changes over time. And the story that's reported on Monday, okay, admittedly, this is back 20th century model, but reported Monday at a particular time is going to look different Tuesday, 24 hours later, and Wednesday after that. Now, information is coming at us so quickly from so many different sources that it's hard to wrap our heads, or at least for me, wrap my head around what the story seems to be at a particular time. But I do know it's going to change. And that doesn't mean that somebody's intentionally trying to, make me believe something not true. It's just, this is where we are. This is what we're trying to, we're trying to show the most accurate representation that we can. And as journalists, we know that it's not complete. Sometimes just wrong. And that's what I would like to see being part of every individual's education, is how is it that I communicate in a way that is most likely to be accurate and less likely to be incomplete. And so tell me more, I agree, is just, it's a nibble, it's a starting point. My favorite is, tell me what that belief does for you. And people go, what? It's true. I go, yeah, I know. But so you believe in the flat earth, you believe X, whatever. How does that play out with your other beliefs? How does that all connect? And I do believe in Quine and other folks who talked about coherence theory of truth as being important for how individuals interact with community. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I think that unless you kind of back somebody into a corner so they're just being defensive, that generally speaking, people want to think that what they think makes sense with other things that they think. And rather than convince people, try to convince people, that I have the answer, because I rarely do. What I like to do is to help people show me how their beliefs cohere, or help them see for themselves how they don't.
I think a problem is that some people are not interested in facts. Now, but some people are. So, but facts, if you want to use philosophy again, Nietzsche, there are no facts, only interpretations. Once you realize that and have a healthy degree of circumspection and a little degree of humor, you can cope with all of this. So, for example, flat earther. How do flat earthers travel? On a plane.
Well, I hear you, which is why I stop and have pause a little bit when you say most people want to have coherent thoughts. I can think of so many examples that I think are that undermine that claim. My esteemed colleague here gives one. I can think of one that's playing out with a recent court decision in Alabama that's raising, hypocrisy, frankly, in how we think about life and zygotes and fertilized eggs and in vitro fertilization. Boom, there's legislation, as opposed to thinking about, where there is dissonance in the beliefs.
Right.
And I think there's lots of examples like that.
And see, when it comes down to it, if I'm going to blame them, it's going to be the educational systems.
Yeah, I know.
Because if we're not taught to be comfortable with dissonance, if we're not taught that it's safe to make mistakes and to learn from our mistakes, it can be hard to pick up that skill. But, you know, I mean, even in higher education, you know, I've spent the last 8 years doing work in ethics education and higher education. Making it safe for our students to make mistakes. Now, it's kind of a rhetorical question because I know we're, you know, kind of done, but, you know, I really wonder, how are you running your classrooms so that students can fail and it's okay? And they can get back up and they can learn from their mistakes or their failure, and they can get better at it. I think that for those of us in higher education, where I think we really do have an opportunity to make big changes politically, although it may not feel like it at the moment, or the state, I think that we need to think about how to model what it is that we think ought to be going on around us.
And to that point, both Jake and Camille in the chat have been having a conversation about.
Can you believe what you said?
No. They both said, Jake says here, I feel like that we've over time turned debate into something that can be won, when it should be really a way to facilitate connection and curiosity.
Exactly.
And I like that approach, the idea that, again, sort of a very much an happy statement, the idea that we should be curious about ethical questions, open to critiquing them. We have Lucy wants to ask you a question, has her hand raised in the chat. Lucy, if you're still with us, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I think it should work.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Hi, Lucy.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for speaking. I have a couple things that I wanted to touch on. I've just been taking notes as you were speaking. And I think that a lot of what you're speaking on, there's a lot of factors at play. So I think the conversation that we've been having right now, like just with this question, it touches on, you know, the time it takes to tell a lie versus the time it takes to dispel one. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people have trouble grappling with, and when they're faced with fake news scenarios and having one-on-one conversations with other people that maybe have a different source of information that doesn't align with reality. And then you spoke about government responsibility with like emerging technology and media. And to that, I say, you know, the people who are making these legislations or laws, they don't even know how the technology works, which is a big problem, I think, especially right now, because everything is happening so quickly and most older folks are already kind of behind. I mean, I know a lot of older people that can't even tell if something was photoshopped, let alone like a deep fake scenario where it's nearly indistinguishable from reality. And you know, if they don't know how the tech works, then how are we going to educate everybody and have these mass education campaigns where we kind of explain how a lot of systems in society work? You know, I use the example of, you know, nobody really knows how to fix a car, but we all have one. I feel that way about computers too, and about how information is spread. I really think that that might actually be the key to eliminating a lot of these questions and problems within like our little information silos that are now created and magnified larger than ever, because we're all kind of living in multiple realities at this point. We have our internet life, we have our you know, personal lives, our work lives. So we're definitely in this very uncharted postmodern space. But yeah, I just wanted to speak on a couple of things at once, because I don't think it's just one thing. It's so many things all at once that need to be addressed. And I don't know if there's one way to address all of it.
Well, Lucy, that's wonderful and global and huge. So thank you for sharing all of those thoughts. A couple of things that I just managed to hold on to while I was listening to everything else you were saying is I really like your car analogy. Because I think that shows us, I don't know if it's a healthy mix, but something that is sustained as a mix between government regulation, technology, and individual use. I trust that the government is holding the car manufacturers to certain safety standards, and then literally knowing their minimums. I trust the car makers to think that they see the importance and efficacy of having a safe car and to supply me with, you know, user manuals and such things. And, you know, and car mechanics in my community so that I can get things fixed even if I can't do it myself, or wonderful IT people who I can call about my computer. So there, you know, there's this dance, this intertwining of responsibility. But what I am arguing here is that every one of us has the opportunity to make a change on a very small level. And is that going to create change that we can see and that's going to be reported on some news organization next week? Probably not. But it's kind of a grassroots approach to ethics, which has a very long honored tradition. I'm responsible for me. I'm not responsible for making you good. I'm responsible for being the best person I can be. And for me, that is, however crazy I think your beliefs are, the only way that I can grow and learn is by understanding where you're coming from. I don't think that helps, Lucy, but it sure felt good to say.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. I know I said a lot, so thank you.
Lucy has me thinking about the mechanics, automobile example too. It feels like ethicists can be the mechanics in that situation. We're supposed to be training drivers on how their vehicles work and giving them some basic knowledge, but then there's still a role for expertise there too.
Ethics, ethicist is auto mechanics. That's a title for something. That's wonderful.
One of our philosophy students, Paul, in the chat asked a question about satire. So he was trying to think about how satire news sources like The Onion that are built around the comedy of misinformation, whether to the extent to which they participate in incorrect news, or do they fall under a category that isn't really traditional news media? Like, where do satire news organizations fit?
I think that's wonderful. And certainly over the years, the difference between satire and deception is actually it's technically consent. The point is that when I read satire, I know that I'm reading satire, or it dawns on me pretty quickly. And if it doesn't, then that information bit moves into the role of deception. It could be my fault in terms of projection of my just not getting it, and I shouldn't be reading The Onion or watching Jon Stewart. Or it could be that what somebody says is satire is a cover up for, I want to lie to you. And best thing I can do is be my best at being naive, at being vulnerable, at being somebody who's trying hard to understand more than I do right now. But satire has, I know it's such a wonderful long tradition, gosh, going back to Aristophanes, one of my great favorite Greek favorites, that it helps us step back from issues if we can satirize them a little bit. It helps us laugh a little bit at the problem. And sometimes laughing at a problem is a good way to begin to unpack it in a way that you can if you're just depressed by it.
I have another question if no one else has any. we were talking a few months back now, I guess, with Dr. Beaver, about the idea of epistemic trespassing. And I can't help but think that that is part of the problem. I recall I was in a talk by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and someone asked him what the biggest problem that he perceives in the country is. And what he responded was that people don't stay in their lanes. Like just because people know something in one area, they assume that they know things in all other areas. And it seems that that's both on the producer or creator, curator, and consumer sides, right? So I wonder why that is to one extent. I guess that's probably an empirical question, because we're all experts of to a certain extent, right? We do certain things for a living, we know certain things because of our social location and life. So we understand how expertise works. We understand that, you know, if you want to know something, you need to go to person X to person Y. But when it comes to some broader issues that exceed, you know, our proximate, I guess, zone of, you know, social, I guess, connection mostly. It seems that we cannot just accept that this is something that kind of encompasses all areas in life, right? That certain people are experts at certain things, they have a deeper understanding. Again, this is not a matter of accuracy or truthfulness. It's a matter of expertise, right? And the fact that someone who is an expert, because they are an expert and have a better understanding overall, are more likely to be true than someone who's not. That doesn't mean that someone who doesn't have expertise will never be true. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, right? So my question to you, I guess, relates to where do you see this fitting as part of the problem? Because this is not, to me, this exceeds the scope of just, you know, media literacy, or this is a matter of character, of overestimating one's abilities, of not being able to, you know, think more broadly about how expertise is transposed in different areas of life and impacts things. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts, I guess.
I'm torn between wanting to ask you some questions back, but I'll respond by saying I think epistemic warrant is the principle here. What is the basis for your belief? You know, we're not talking, you've said this, we're not talking about what's metaphysically true, you know, what's out there. Here's such a thing. We're talking about perception, and we're talking about presentation. And that's where, again, I get into power and responsibility of the individual. I have a absolutely gorgeous 3-year-old niece, grandniece, excuse me, who she is so sure of everything. And in fact, she'll tell me, she'll say, in my whole life, I never saw that. And she's so sure of herself because she has 3 years experience. And it's hard to argue with that. But what we find amusing in a 3-year-old is not so amusing in a 30-year-old. And so I think that the important thing is how, as an individual, as a parent, as a grandparent, as a teacher, as a whatever I am at the moment, how do I help people get from that 3-year-old stage to that 30-year-old stage with a sense of wonder and of I still have so much to learn. You know, I think we don't teach people epistemic warrant. Just like we don't teach people media literacy or critical thinking outside of our philosophy classrooms. And I think that's a real problem. I want to be the auto mechanic of morality.
I have one question. I feel though back because I love that response, and I would love to end on such a upbeat note. So hopefully, you'll have a good more upbeat. A concern I haven't had, and this is a concern that shows up all over, is right. It seems like the thing I feel like I ought to do to be a good consumer of media, a good sharer, right? Is like be careful about what I'm doing. whatever this description is, but that. I have this worry that, well, are my ideological opponents or the people on the other side, when I really care about these outcomes, I don't just want truth, I want flourishing or whatever, right? Am I just setting myself up for failure by like they're being, I mean, of course we all are, I want to be clear, but imagine only they're being hyperbolic, only they're relying on clickbait and so forth, and I'm not. Or am I just setting myself up to lose? And is there an answer you can give to why, maybe I shouldn't feel like there's a tension here between behaving well or like trying to sensationalize in a way that's gonna, even if I'm sensationalizing on behalf of the round earth rather than the flat earth or something.
A wonderful question. I think back to, I mean, psychologically, I think it's a boundaries issue.
Right.
I can't fix you.
I mean, I love that response too. I think that's important. It's like,
All I can do is try to understand where you're coming from and why. And if I ask the question skillfully enough, then I'm going to help you wonder about that too. And that's where growth begins.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Can we do a round of applause? We've got other questions that we'll have to talk about later. I'm going to connect you with at least one person in the chat who wants to talk media literacy fiction.
Oh, good.
So we'll do that later as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to be in touch with any of you virtually or, people who are here. It's all about conversation.
To folks here and also in Zoom, I want to thank Dr. Denny Elliott for leading this discussion today. That was fantastic. I also want to thank Dr. Beaver for curating our questions, and thank you for excellent questions, especially the many folks in Zoom who join us and are so engaged. I just want to pitch our next event, which will be in about a month's time. You can go on the UCF Center for Ethics webpage and sign up for that if you want to join remotely. And that's going to be more on AI. It seems to be the topic of the year, and we can't escape. Dr. Darby Vickers is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of San Diego, and she's going to be talking about living well with AI, virtue, education, and artificial intelligence. So I think a lot of these themes are going to map right onto the next event, and I hope to see many of you there. That's going to be, thank you, the 26th of March, and to everyone that surrendered your email address as part of Zoom, I will be spamming you to tell you more.
I was gonna say, I hope I'm on the mailing.
Yes, you are, unless you say please stop. So I'll send that out. And we'll also have the recording for this event posted. So thank you again very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Yeah.
I so appreciate your comments and questions.